When Nazi Germany collapsed in May 1945, the last gunfire faded away, but another door opened, darker and harsher, for the women who had once stood beside the most powerful men around Hitler. Have you ever wondered what happened to them after the swastika flag came down? After the shouting crowds disappeared into the ruins of Berlin? A few, like Magda Goebbels, chose not to continue living and even ended the lives of their children. Most others faced arrest, internment, or years of quiet exile. Others spent long years behind barbed wire in Allied prison camps. A few lived for decades in quiet hardship and shame, carrying names that history would never fully forgive. These women were not silent shadows. They had walked next to absolute power, watched Hitler from the front rows, raised their children to honor the swastika, and lived in comfort while millions suffered. But when the Third Reich collapsed overnight, the world they believed would last forever shattered instantly. And what followed was just as unforgiving. This is not simply a story about after the war. It is a story that begins after every gun went silent, every flag was pulled down, and every courtroom delivered its final judgment. From the concrete tomb beneath Berlin to prison camps across occupied Germany, from desperate escapes to decades of unwavering loyalty, each woman faced her own reckoning. In the final weeks of April 1945, Berlin was dying. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night, turning grand buildings into broken shells. Fires burned across entire neighborhoods. The air itself seemed to shake with explosions. Above the Reich Chancellery, the red flag with the black swastika still flew, but everyone knew the end had come. Deep underground, in a concrete bunker beneath the Chancellery Gardens, the final remnants of Nazi leadership waited for the inevitable. The bunker was a cold, cramped maze of corridors and small rooms, lit by harsh electric bulbs, powered by diesel generators that coughed and rumbled in the background. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with damp concrete and unwashed bodies. Here, 30 feet below the surface, Hitler and his inner circle lived their last days. Among those who chose to stay was Magda Goebbels. She was 43 years old that April, still elegant despite the circumstances, her blonde hair carefully arranged even as the world collapsed above her. Magda was the wife of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, the man whose voice had filled German radios for 12 years with promises of victory and speeches dripping with hate. They had been married since 1931, and together they had become symbols of Nazi family values. 6 children, all with names beginning with H in honor of Hitler: Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda, and Haida. The oldest was 12, the youngest was 4. Many in the Nazi elite had fled Berlin when they still could. Göring had gone south. Himmler had disappeared into the chaos. But the Goebbels family moved into the Führer bunker in mid-April with their children, bringing suitcases and photographs, settling into the small rooms as if they might stay forever. People who were there later remembered Magda moving through those underground corridors with an unsettling calm. She organized meals for the children, read them stories, kept to a routine as if bombs weren't falling overhead. She had once told people that Hitler was like a father to her children. She called him Uncle Führer. The children had grown up in that world, attending party rallies, meeting SS officers, learning that they were special because of who their parents were. Hitler's secretaries, the ones who survived to tell the story, recalled that Magda seemed to float through those final days in a kind of trance. She appeared composed, almost serene, even as Hitler raged about betrayal and Soviet armies closed in from all sides. She had made her decision, though no one yet knew what it was. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces fought their way through Berlin's streets less than a mile away, Adolf Hitler retreated to his private quarters with Eva Braun, the woman he had married just hours before. In the afternoon, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker's concrete halls. Hitler was dead. The small group remaining in the bunker moved quietly, efficiently. They wrapped the bodies, carried them up the stairs to the Chancellery garden, doused them with gasoline, and lit them on fire while Soviet shells whistled overhead. Magda Goebbels witnessed this, standing at a distance, watching the black smoke rise into the grey Berlin sky. Her husband Joseph was now the Reich Chancellor, a title Hitler had given him in his final will, although it no longer carried real power. It was a title that meant nothing. The Reich had less than a day left to exist. That evening, May 1st, 1945, as darkness fell over the ruined city, Magda Goebbels went to the small room where her children slept. What happened next was documented later by the few who survived the bunker and by Soviet forces who found the bodies. The children were given something to help them sleep, perhaps told it was medicine for the noise of the bombs. Dr. Helmut Kunz, a dentist who was in the bunker, later testified about that night, though his testimony was vague and contradictory, as if his mind couldn't fully accept what he had witnessed. The children passed away from cyanide poisoning. All of the children, in their beds, while they slept. Soviet troops who entered the bunker on May 2nd found them there, dressed in their night clothes, looking as if they might wake up. Magda had left letters. In one, written to an old friend, she had written words that chilled even hardened soldiers when they were found later. The world that comes after the Führer and National Socialism is not worth living in, and therefore I have brought the children here. They are too good for the life that would come after, and a gracious God will understand me when I myself give them deliverance. After the children passed away, Magda and Joseph Goebbels walked up the stairs from the bunker to the Reich Chancellery garden. It was sometime in the evening, still light in the Berlin spring. SS guards who were there said the couple walked side by side, not speaking. They apparently bit down on cyanide capsules. Some accounts suggest that an SS guard also shot them to make certain, though this detail remains disputed. Their bodies were burned, just as Hitler's had been the day before, though there wasn't much gasoline left, so the burning was incomplete. Even among the SS officers who had spent years following brutal orders, who had seen things that would haunt them forever, what Magda Goebbels did shocked them. The idea that a mother would choose the passing of her children rather than let them live in a defeated Germany seemed to cross a line that even war hadn't prepared them for. But Magda Goebbels wasn't the only Nazi wife facing the end. While she made her terrible choice in that underground bunker, other women were scattered across the dying Reich, each confronting what came next in her own way. Margarete Himmler believed in her husband's work, even though she claimed never to fully understand it. Born Margarete Boden on September 9, 1893, in the city of Bromberg, she came from a respectable middle-class family. She trained as a nurse, and by all accounts she was good at her profession, caring for patients with skill and dedication. On July 3, 1928, she married Heinrich Himmler, who was involved in political activity at the time and had previously worked in agriculture. Few could have predicted then that her husband would become one of the most powerful and most feared men in Europe. By 1945, Heinrich Himmler commanded the SS and had major influence over the Gestapo and the concentration camp system, even though these organizations had their own internal structures. His signature appeared on orders that sent millions to their deaths and their passing. He was the architect of machinery designed for industrial-scale murder. Margarete wasn't in the inner circle of Nazi politics. She didn't attend high-level meetings or help plan military campaigns, but she lived well from her husband's position. They had a daughter, Gudrun, born August 8, 1929, and Margaret raised her in a comfortable home while Heinrich traveled constantly on SS business. During the war years, Margarete volunteered with the German Red Cross, visiting wounded soldiers in field hospitals, bringing them small comforts, writing letters home for those who couldn't write themselves. After the war, when Allied investigators examined her correspondence, they found letters that painted a clear picture. She wrote admiringly of Hitler, praised Nazi victories, and expressed pride in Heinrich's work. In one letter from 1942, she had written to a friend, "Heinrich worked so hard for the fatherland. I am proud to be married to a man of such dedication." She may not have known every detail of what happened in places like Auschwitz and Treblinka, but she knew enough. She knew her husband commanded the SS. She knew the SS ran the camps, and she never asked questions she didn't want answered. When the end came in early May 1945, Heinrich Himmler tried to negotiate. He had sent peace feelers to the Western Allies through a Swedish intermediary, Count Folke Bernadotte, hoping to arrange a surrender that would spare Germany from complete Soviet occupation. When Hitler learned of this betrayal on April 28th, he flew into one of his final rages. He stripped Himmler of all ranks and titles and ordered his arrest. But Himmler was already gone, fleeing south from Berlin with a small group of aides, trying to disappear into the chaos of Germany's collapse. He shaved his moustache, put on a private's uniform, and carried false papers identifying him as Heinrich Hitzinger. For several days, he wandered through the British occupation zone near Bremen, just one more face among millions of displaced soldiers and refugees. On May 23, 1945, British soldiers at a checkpoint near Bremerwörde detained a group of suspicious men. During questioning, one of them seemed nervous, evasive. When the British officer asked him to remove his eye patch, recognition dawned. This was no ordinary soldier. They put Himmler in a room to search him. He may have known what was coming. Before they could stop him, he bit down on a cyanide capsule he had hidden in his mouth. The British doctor tried to save him, forced his mouth open, reached for the poison, but it was too late. Heinrich Himmler died a short time after taking a cyanide capsule, sometime late that evening, and the British soldiers could not save him. Margaret Himmler was arrested by Allied forces in May 1945. She had fled there with Gudrun as Germany collapsed, hoping to hide among the refugees flooding south toward the Alps. Allied military police found her in a small town, living under an assumed name. She didn't resist. Perhaps she had known this moment would come. They took her to an American internment camp, one of many being set up across occupied Germany to hold thousands of Nazi party members and their families, while authorities figured out what to do with them all. The camps weren't death camps, nothing like what her husband had overseen, but they were far from comfortable. Barbed wire fences, crowded barracks, limited food, uncertainty hanging over everything. Margareta Himmler was held in Allied custody for roughly a year and a half after the war, before being released in 1946, and her denazification case continued in the following years. Guards watched her. Interrogators questioned her repeatedly. What did she know? When did she know it? What had Heinrich told her about his work? She maintained the same story. She was only a housewife and a nurse, uninvolved in politics, unaware of her husband's crimes. "I only knew what any German housewife knew," she told the interrogators. "What was in the newspapers?" But her letters told a different story. The investigators had found boxes of correspondence, years of letters exchanged with friends and family. They showed pride in Nazi ideology, approval of Hitler's goals, satisfaction with Germany's conquests. One letter from 1940, after the fall of France, expressed joy that Europe is finally being united under proper leadership. In post-war denazification proceedings, Margareta Himmler was ultimately classified as an offender rather than a major war criminal. She received a relatively mild sentence, including a short period of compulsory labor and loss of some civil rights and pension benefits rather than a multi-year prison term. After her release in 1949, Margaret Himmler changed her name and moved to Munich. After her release, she lived quietly in Munich, and she avoided public attention for the rest of her life. Her daughter Gudrun, who had been raised to worship her father, never stopped defending his memory. Gudrun would later join Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, an organization that aided Nazi fugitives escaping justice. But Margaret herself withdrew from public life entirely. No interviews, no statements, no attempts to justify or explain. Neighbors who lived near her in the 1960s later said they had no idea who she was. Just a quiet older woman who kept her curtains drawn and rarely spoke to anyone. She passed away on August 25, 1967, at age 73, in a Munich hospital. The death certificate listed her cause of passing as heart failure. Her funeral was small and private. Few people attended. By then, the name Himmler had become synonymous with evil in a way that few other names ever have. She had lived 22 years after her husband's passing, 2 decades in a kind of internal exile, and she took whatever she really knew to her final resting place. Gerda Bormann never knew what happened to her husband, and the uncertainty may have been worse than knowing. Martin Bormann became one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, operating behind the scenes as Hitler's private secretary. He controlled access to Hitler and shaped decisions through documents and signatures. Few Germans knew his name, but inside the Reich he was feared. He married Gerda Buch in 1929. Her family was deeply tied to the Nazi Party, and both she and Martin were committed believers. They had 10 children, all raised with strict Nazi ideology. Letters found after the war show a couple united in purpose, speaking confidently about a 1,000-year Reich. By April 1945, that vision was collapsing. Bormann was inside the Führer bunker when Hitler passed away on April 30th. The next night he joined a breakout attempt as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. Survivors described darkness, fire, and chaos as the group tried to escape the encirclement. The last confirmed sighting of Bormann was near the Lehrte railway station early on May 2nd, before he vanished. When Berlin fell, there was no body and no proof of his passing. Rumors spread quickly. Escape to South America, capture by the Soviets, a new identity somewhere in Europe. For Gerda, waiting in Bavaria with 10 children, the uncertainty was torment. The Allies did not wait. At Nuremberg, Bormann was indicted in absentia. Lawyers defended an empty chair. He was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and sentenced to death, though there was no man to execute. The children struggled with the family's reputation, and some faced difficult treatment from others, although detailed reports are limited. Gerda insisted he was alive. She told her children he would return, refused condolences, and lived in a state where she could neither mourn nor move forward. The name Bormann became a symbol of Nazi evil. And, in early 1946, Gerda fell seriously ill. Doctors said she was suffering from severe cancer. She had carried enormous emotional strain while caring for 10 children in a ruined country. She died on March 23, 1946, at only 36, still believing her husband might come home. Her children scattered after her death. The eldest became a Catholic priest, trying to atone for a legacy he had not chosen. Others changed their names or clung to the ideology they had been raised with. One daughter spent years following rumors of her father across Europe and South America. The mystery continued for decades. In December 1972, construction workers in West Berlin uncovered skeletal remains near the place where Bormann was last seen. Dental checks suggested it was him, but doubts lingered until 1998, when DNA testing confirmed the identity. He had passed away in early May 1945, likely by cyanide, only a short distance from his last known location. Gerda Bormann had been dead for nearly half a century when the truth finally emerged. She never received closure, never knew what became of him, and lived her final year in a limbo as brutal as any sentence. Ilse Hess spent 50 years trying to convince the world that her husband was innocent. She never stopped. Born in 1900 in Hanover, she grew up as the daughter of a military doctor. She met Rudolf Hess in 1920 at a political meeting in Munich, where both were drawn to the early Nazi movement. They married in 1927 and shared the same beliefs and loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Rudolf rose through the ranks, becoming Deputy Führer and one of Hitler's closest followers. Everything changed on May 10, 1941, when Rudolf Hess flew alone to Scotland. He took a Messerschmitt Bf 110, crossed the North Sea, and parachuted near Eaglesham. He told his British captors he had come to negotiate peace between Germany and Britain. Hitler reacted with fury, declared Hess insane, and erased his name from Nazi public life. Ilse, left in Germany with their son, found herself in a strange limbo. Rudolf was alive, but unreachable. During the war, he was held in British custody and examined by psychiatrists. He insisted he had acted for peace, but still believed in Hitler. After Germany's defeat, Ilse was arrested like many Nazi wives. Her involvement was limited, and she was classified as a lesser offender, fined and released. Rudolf Hess was taken to Nuremberg in 1945. Ilse followed the trial obsessively. His behavior shifted between clarity and claims of memory loss. Doctors debated his sanity. On October 1, 1946, he was convicted of crimes against peace and conspiracy to wage aggressive war. He received a life sentence and was sent to Spandau prison with 6 other Nazi leaders. This was when Ilse began her lifelong campaign. She wrote many letters, sometimes hundreds over the years, to officials, politicians, and international groups, and she repeated the same message again and again. Her message was always the same. Rudolf had flown to Scotland as a peace envoy, acting alone and trying to stop bloodshed. She insisted he was not a war criminal, but a man punished for trying to prevent war. She published articles, gave interviews, and in 1969 released her book, Prisoner of Peace, arguing her case again. But public opinion did not change. By the 1960s, Rudolf Hess was the only prisoner left in Spandau. The prison remained open solely for him, with the 4 Allied powers rotating control. Many called for his release on humanitarian grounds, but the Soviet Union always refused. Visits were rare and tightly controlled. Through the glass partition, Ilse brought family news and spoke of hope. She stayed loyal, attending far-right gatherings and defending Rudolf at every opportunity. She never acknowledged the crimes of the regime they had supported. On August 17, 1987, Rudolf Hess was found dead at age 93, hanged in a garden shed. The official ruling was suicide, but conspiracy theories spread instantly. Ilse rejected the suicide verdict, claiming he had been murdered to stop his release. She demanded inquiries that went nowhere. Ilse spent her final years in Hinterland, living in the house she once shared with Rudolf. She gave occasional interviews, always repeating the same belief. Her husband was innocent, and history had wronged him. She never expressed regret for their shared ideology. Ilse Hess died on September 7, 1995, at age 95. Neo-Nazi groups attended her funeral and gave Hitler salutis. She was buried near Rudolf. On her gravestone were the words she had chosen herself, loyal until death. To the very end, she held on to the same cause and the same man, regardless of the suffering that cause had brought to the world. Not every Nazi wife stood by her husband's crimes. One woman chose a different path, though history nearly lost her story. Emily Schindler was born Emily Pelzel in 1907 in a small farming town in Austria-Hungary. She married Oskar Schindler in 1928, long before either of them imagined the world they would enter. Oskar joined the Nazi Party in the late 1930s, and many historians believe he did it mainly for business reasons rather than ideology. When Germany invaded Poland, he took over a confiscated factory in Krakow and hired Jewish workers mainly because they were cheaper. But as deportations began and the occupation grew brutal, something shifted. Oskar started protecting his workers, and Emily worked beside him. While Oskar bribed SS officers, Emily did quieter work. She cared for sick workers, hid people during inspections, secured food on the black market, and forged medical notes to keep the fragile off transport lists. In 1944, the Schindlers moved their factory to Brünnlitz, bringing more than 1,000 workers with them. The famous list saved lives, but Emily's part was often overlooked. During the final months of the war, she nursed workers through typhus, risked her life repeatedly, and spent their last resources on food. When the Soviets arrived in May 1945, every worker had survived. Before the Schindlers fled, the workers gave them a letter of protection and a gold ring engraved with a line from the Talmud. Jewish organizations later helped them reach Argentina in 1949. There, Oscar failed at every business attempt and eventually left Emily. She stayed in Argentina and lived with very limited money, and she supported herself in simple ways during those difficult years. When Schindler's List was released in 1993, she saw the film and felt nearly erased from the story. Only in 1994 did Yad Vashem honor her as righteous among the nations. Her 1995 memoir finally told her perspective. Emily Schindler died in 2001, aged 93. She was buried in Waldkraiburg, Germany, where she had spent her later years. Her life showed that a Nazi wife could choose conscience over ideology, though she almost vanished from history. While Emily represents rare moral courage, other wives faded by choice or necessity. Margaret Speer, the wife of Albert Speer, left very few personal records. She stayed out of public life, and she died in 1987. They had 6 children and lived comfortably during the Nazi years. Margarete Speer attended some events, but mostly focused on family life. When Albert was arrested, Margaret chose silence. She avoided Nuremberg, avoided interviews, and never defended or condemned him. She moved to Heidelberg, raised the children, and visited Albert only under strict prison rules. When he was released in 1966 and became famous for his memoir Inside the Third Reich, she remained private. They lived mostly separate lives until her death in 1987. She left behind almost nothing. No memoirs, no public reflections. Annie Rayborn, better known after marriage as Annie Brandt, was the wife of Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, and the man who served as Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, making him one of the chief architects of the Action T4 program. After the war, Karl Brandt was arrested and placed on trial during the doctor's trial at Nuremberg. The tribunal found him guilty of crimes against humanity, and he was executed in 1948. In the aftermath of his execution, Annie Brandt faded from public life. Allied authorities seized her property, and although she was questioned extensively, investigators ultimately found insufficient evidence to charge her with any role in her husband's crimes. She spent the post-war years living quietly in West Germany, avoiding publicity and political involvement. She remained out of the public eye for the rest of her life and died in 1986 in Essen. In her own way, she succeeded at erasing herself from history. Unlike the well-known wives of top Nazi leaders, her name faded into silence, leaving behind only questions. Some Nazi wives never showed regret or questioned the crimes of the regime, and they stayed loyal not only to their husbands, but also to the ideology. Lena Heydrich became the clearest example of this loyalty. Lena von Osten met Reinhard Heydrich in 1930, and they married in 1931 as his SS career began to rise, and by 1942 he had become one of the most powerful and feared men in Europe. Lena lived in comfort in Prague, and she raised their 4 children in a world full of privilege. She clearly understood his role and supported him, but everything changed when resistance fighters attacked Heydrich's car on May 27, 1942, and he died 8 days later from his injuries, which helped trigger brutal reprisals ordered by Hitler. After the war, Lena was arrested and questioned, but she was never convicted, and she returned to her home island to continue her life while defending her husband for the rest of her days. She often said that Heydrich only did his duty, and she tried to minimize the Holocaust in interviews. In 1976, she wrote, Life with a War Criminal, where she continued to praise Heydrich and described him as a talented man ruined by war, and she never changed her beliefs until her death in 1985. Henriette von Schirach, the wife of Baldur von Schirach, lived close to Hitler for many years, and after the war Baldur was sentenced to 20 years in prison, while Henriette was detained, but later released as a minor supporter. She later divorced Baldur, which was unusual for Nazi wives, and she wrote a memoir saying she had been young and blinded by power, but she avoided taking full responsibility for the harm caused by her husband's actions. She lived a quiet life afterward and died in 1992, rarely speaking about the past. Ingeborg Dönitz, the wife of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, chose to remain silent in public, and she never gave any clear statements about the regime or her own views, and although her husband spent 10 years in prison after Nuremberg, she never spoke publicly about the regime or her own views. She had already lost 2 sons during the war, and perhaps her grief made silence feel safer, and she lived quietly until her death in 1962, taking her thoughts about the Third Reich with her. Between May and August 1945, Allied authorities detained many former Nazi officials and members across occupied Germany, and mass arrests often took place early in the morning. Military police would arrive, present authorization, and take people away while children stood frozen, unsure if their mothers would ever come home. Internment camps were then set up across Germany. Some were former hotels with beds and regular meals, while others were harsh places with tents, little food, and constant fear. Most wives of high-ranking Nazis did not personally sign killing orders, yet research has shown that some women in the Nazi system, including wives, secretaries, and nurses, directly assisted or participated in persecution and killings. So the question remained, what responsibility did they carry? Beginning in 1946, denazification tribunals classified individuals into 5 categories, from major offenders to persons exonerated, to decide their level of responsibility. For the wives, the core questions were simple. What did you know? What did you support? Most insisted they knew nothing. I was just a housewife. But evidence often showed otherwise. Letters praised Nazi victories. Photos showed them at SS events. Servants and neighbors testified about their loyalties. Sentences varied. Some women received years in prison, others faced fines or job restrictions. A few were cleared entirely. Yet even those who escaped prison suffered in other ways. Being labeled the wife of an SS officer or Gestapo agent was a social death. Neighbors avoided them. Employers refused to hire them. The children of former Nazi officials often faced social stigma and rejection in post-war Germany, and some reported difficult experiences. Many women tried to vanish by changing their names. Post-war chaos made reinvention possible. Others could not disappear, their faces too well known, their connections too public. They lived in a kind of internal exile, never fully accepted again. Financial ruin was common. Property was seized, bank accounts frozen. Women who once lived with servants now struggled in small apartments with no income. Depression, isolation, and even suicide attempts appeared in the historical record. A few stayed defiant, but often that defiance looked more like a shield than true strength. Their children carried the burden into the next generation. Some rejected their parents' actions. Martin Bormann Jr., for example, became a Catholic priest and spent decades speaking about the danger of ignoring evil. Others went the opposite direction, defending their parents and even joining neo-Nazi groups. Gudrun Himmler dedicated her life to helping Nazi war criminals, believing she was honoring her father. The third generation still deals with this history. Some have become historians, others prefer silence. But as archives opened, the truth became clearer. Many wives knew more than they claimed. They knew about deportations and camps. Many top Nazi families benefited from expropriated property, including homes and furnishings, taken from persecuted Jews and other victims. However, the extent and form of this enrichment varied from family to family. By Nuremberg standards, most were not guilty of specific crimes, but morally they carried a heavy burden. They chose not to see, not to ask, and not to question what they supported. When the reckoning finally arrived, some accepted responsibility, some denied everything, and many lived in the grey space between, unable to find peace. The wives of Nazi leaders faced consequences that varied from immediate passing to decades of shame, from prison sentences to social exile, from defiant loyalty to quiet disappearance. Their fates were brutal not because of arbitrary Allied vengeance, but because they had lived at the center of a regime that murdered millions. Magda Goebbels chose the passing of herself and her children rather than face a world without National Socialism. Margaret Himmler was detained for a short period after the war and later lived under tight restrictions, and she eventually passed away in obscurity. Gerda Bormann passed away not knowing what happened to her husband, that uncertainty perhaps worse than knowing. Ilse Hess spent 50 years defending a man who helped start a war that killed millions. Emily Schindler risked her life to save others and was rewarded with poverty and near-total historical erasure. Lena Heydrich remained unrepentant until her passing, defending the indefensible. Some understood what they had supported and carried that knowledge to their graves. Others never did, living their final years insisting they were victims, that they hadn't known, that their husbands had been misunderstood. Many existed in a grey area between denial and acknowledgement, unable to fully face what they had been part of, but also unable to entirely deny it. Their stories reveal an uncomfortable truth that echoes across time. Evil systems require not just architects and executioners, but also supporters, enablers, and those willing to look away. The wives who lived in luxury while millions perished in camps bore responsibility, even if they never pulled a trigger or signed a death warrant. They benefited from evil. They raised children in hate. They celebrated victories built on atrocities. When the Nazi regime collapsed in May 1945, many who had taken part in it eventually faced a reckoning, and the consequences came in very different forms. For these women, that reckoning took different forms, some swift and final, others stretched across decades. But none escaped it entirely. They discovered that proximity to power, that benefit from evil, that choice to look away, all of it comes with a price. And that price, history shows, is eternal. The consequences weren't just legal or financial. They were social, psychological, and intergenerational. The stain on their names never fully washed away. Their children carried it forward. Their grandchildren still grapple with it today. The choices they made, the ideology they supported, the evil they enabled, it all echoes through time, a reminder that complicity has consequences that last far beyond one person's lifetime. In the end, the brutal fate of Nazi leaders' wives serves as a stark lesson. When you bind yourself to evil, when you build your life on the suffering of others, when you choose comfort over conscience, the day of reckoning will come. And when it does, no amount of claimed ignorance, no assertions of innocence, no years of defending the indefensible can undo what was done or escape what was earned. History remembers, even when we try to forget. And the price of power built on evil is paid not just by those who wielded it, but by those who stood beside them, benefited from it, and chose not to see. If you found this historical account compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring history to life. We explore the untold narratives, the forgotten voices, and the hard truths that shaped our world. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into history. Your support helps us continue researching and sharing these important stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.